Yeah, that's not really interesting enough. That's something you share with my former students. So. Well, thank you all for remembering that we're still doing this. Those of you that get, I was telling Ron, get folks out of the habit for a couple of weeks, and you wonder who's going to come back. But I do have the Baptist Women in the 20th Century sign up if you wanted to get Jennifer Hawk's article, Beth Eccles, and you have not had a chance to sign up. Have you? Do I need to give that to people? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'll pass that on. Beyond that, I think we're ready. Do we have any questions or?
Jennifer did a very good job of that last week.
She did. Yeah, I was glad for her to do that. Glad that opportunity worked out timing-wise. So, and would you believe I just found out a moment ago that Thomas was singing the national anthem again, and I didn't tell me that he was doing that. So, little snot again. Yes, didn't tell me. So.
I guess they liked him.
We'll have to hear how it goes, but that's okay. All right, well, when last we left our heroes, you might recall that the flood had just ended. Noah had ended up in a very strange circumstance with his son Ham, which had allowed the curse to come on his grandson Canaan. At that point, we get an interlude again. We get another one of those sections that's hard to read when you're trying to read the Bible through in a year. This one is called the Table of Nations. It's like a genealogy, but it's not quite like a genealogy. Genealogies kind of go linearly. This person begat this person. This one is about nations instead of people. And it's really organized around the three sons of Noah. It provides etiologies for the nations as they were understood at the time of the writing, so you get an understanding of where these people think these other nations descended from. If you don't know the word etiology, some of you may and may not, my simple definition of that word is a story that answers a why question. So why do we have seasons? Why is the world like this? Why is the world like that? Anytime you're answering those kinds of causal questions. For some people, those etiologies are synonymous to the word myth. I don't necessarily go there. I think you can have stories that have basis in history that answer why questions. I don't think you have to go there. But of course, you're probably most familiar with kind of the epic myths of the ancient world, like, Persephone having to go to Hades for 6 months out of the year, which is why we have winter. That kind of a story. That's an etiology for why the seasons come. But this understands, why do we have nations the way we do? And I should say ethnicity is connected, I'm trying to get my arrow out of the way. Ethnicity is connected to language and geography. So you're not thinking about race the way we think about race, because you have all range of shades of individuals in this time, in this place. They were thinking about geographic location, and they were thinking about the language that those people spoke. So let me pick up in Genesis 10. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, children who were born to them after the flood. What's significant about this, first of all, there are 70 of them. But of course there are 70 of them, because if you needed some indication that it's the whole world, that's what it's trying to say. 7, that number of completeness, times an order of magnitude in 10. So this is the whole world as they understood it. Everybody comes from this. We'll start with Japheth. We'll work our way back. That's what usually happened, by the way. You always got the genealogies or the stories of the unchosen ones before you get the chosen ones. You get Cain before you get Seth. You get Esau before you get Jacob. You get, obviously, Japheth and Ham before you get Shem, because that's where the Shem is what gives us the term for Semitic peoples. There was what's known as a sheen, let me get it right, a sheen shift, or a scene shift, because there's one letter in Hebrew that can be sh or s. It's the same letter, and it just depends on which side the one dot is on how you say it. And so that is why in the book of Judges that the password was shibboleth, because some people in the Semitic culture said sibboleth. They couldn't make the sh sound. That's why we have shalom in Hebrew and salam in Arabic. That's the same word. So that's where that sheen shift comes from. So Shem gives us the Semitic peoples. That's the same letter that you get there. What's significant about these 3 sections is the way each of them finish. With their own language by their families in their nations. So at this point, we already have division of languages in Genesis 10. And that follows each time. We talk about Ham, and then we get a little bit of development on Canaan, because remember, that's significant with regard to the curse that's coming on Canaanites later on. And then their languages and their lands. And then Shem also, the father of Eber, that's where you get the word Hebrew, by the way, Eber, to cross over. And then, again, their languages and their lands and nations. So the understanding of a plurality of language is already happening in Genesis 10. That is, that each culture has their own language and their own places. So I think it's pretty obvious that we're not reading these texts chronologically. Genesis 11 is not coming immediately following Genesis 10, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So they're not putting it in a kind of history order that we would like them to put it in. They're thinking about it in a different way. So, and then we close with these are the families of Noah's sons, and that's a nice inclusio for the chapter, because you have that line at the beginning and you have that line at the end. So I just wanted to mention Genesis 10 because again, these genealogies move us forward in time. They let us. It's not a commercial that way. It actually moves us forward a little bit. Do you have questions or thoughts or concerns? Yes, sir.
You said Eber was how you get the word Hebrew.
It is.
Is that based on their cultural tradition of where the word comes from?
Yes.
Or is that?
Well, it's where. Yeah. I mean, it's the word Ivri is based on. It's spelled the same way. It's a
Okay.
ayin beit resh, and I don't know exactly the root. It's actually the verb for to cross over, and so I don't know where that root is coming from.
I've read elsewhere that there's like identified by the Egyptians, a people like of nomads.
Mhm. That's
Habiru.
correct. The Habiru, yes. The Habiru were mercenaries that hired themselves out to the king of Shechem. Their story is recorded in what's called the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters date to 15th, 14th century BC in Egypt. And they were basically a collection of letters from mayors, governors of cities in Palestine asking for aid. And one of the letters is complaining because the head of Shechem has taken on these Abiru as mercenary fighters, and it's not fair. They're beating up on everybody, and they want the Egyptians to come and solve this problem. There has been long time speculation as to what the relationship between the Abiru and the Hebrews are. That name is awfully close. And there does seem to be some friendly disposition toward the Hebrews and Shechem. In the book of Joshua, when Israel invades the land, they cross over the Jordan, they destroy Jericho, they go to Ai, they have their defeated Ai, then they have the great victory at Ai, then they go to Shechem and they have a revival service. They don't destroy Shechem. They have a covenant renewal ceremony. And it said that they and the aliens who were among them in Joshua chapter 8. And so the speculation has been for a long time that there was some kinship at Shechem. And some have wondered if, I think it was George Kelm, who was an archaeologist at Southwestern Seminary, wrote a book in which he suggested that as the rights of Hebrews were being curtailed in Egypt, that people escaped prior to the Exodus in generations, and there was an understanding that one friendly place they could go would be Shechem, and that maybe there is some connection between these ancient Hebrews and these Habiru. That is complete speculation. It's just trying to make some sense of if there is a connection. But yeah, the Habiru, obviously it's a Semitic word. It sounds a lot like Eber, so maybe.
It's a Semitic word.
It is, yeah,
Okay.
it seems to be.
I thought it was something they pulled from hieroglyphs.
Well, it's in the letters, and it's
Geometric
written.
without vowels.
Yeah, it would not have vowels, no, so, but it would be, but, I mean, what's funny about this is this letter that we have as an E here, they had consonants that had no sound that would hold places for a vowel sound. They were silent letters, and so there are three root letters there. The E is a consonant there, the B is a consonant, and the R is a consonant. Yeah, so, yeah, that's what's happening there.
That's fair.
Yeah. And sometimes it's Habiru, it's a rough breathing mark. So that makes it even sound even closer to Hebrews. So, I don't know. So,
What's the value of this for us?
yeah, well, that's a deep dive. That was answering his question.
I know, I said, no, not that. Just the value of this chapter. In
Oh.
the scriptures, what's the value?
Sure, for me,
That question like that would have been kind of catty, wouldn't it?
yeah, that was a
How
little,
much was it?
little bit. Dang, Bob, that's,
Just to be clear.
Bob just made a power move. We won't be asking any more questions. No, the Genesis 10, I think, does what the genealogies do for us. They move us ahead in the story. They give us some understanding of the relationships between nations, at least in the mind of the ancient Hebrews. So that the people who are the children of Canaan, they're going to be the bad guys. The Girgashites, the Hittites, the Argonites, those are all going to be the bad guys in this story, because obviously look at the stock they're coming from, and they've been cursed. These are, I don't know, these are all the Egyptian folks. So we've got Egypt proper, we've got Ethiopia, we've got Libya. Put is Libya, Cush is Ethiopia, Sub-Saharan or Black Africa. So they're all in one group also. And then of course the good guys, Shem, the people of Eber, Aram, who else is in this list that might be significant? Sheleph, which would come from the Shelah. Yeah, so those are to tell us who's connected here. Misha, who would be connected to Moab. So it's just you don't know the fighters without the program here. So, yeah.
I would like to check something with you.
Sure.
You've shown us several pages.
Yes.
And all the names seem to be male names.
Yes.
Is that so?
That is.
What about women? Were they ever mentioned?
In genealogy lists, rarely.
Any of them?
Oh, in lists? Rarely. One caveat there. Anytime a king's genealogy is mentioned for Israel, his mother is mentioned. The queen mother seems to be important in the way they list it. Other than that, you would get the daughters of Rebekah, the daughters of Rachel, or the sons of Rebekah, Rachel and Leah, just to separate which kids came from whom at that point. But for the most part, no.
Can we then conclude that they were unimportant or ignored?
I think so. Except the only thing that makes me wonder, I mean, yes, absolutely, women were little more than property very often. But the fact that Queen Mother is named is always fascinating to me. I don't know what that means. I think it means something, but I don't know what it means. And that's a good question. The only other place in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, you have 4 women that are named. And obviously in that case, 4 very interesting women. You have Rahab, who else is there? Rahab, I've lost her name now, Genesis 38, Tamar, Ruth, and Bathsheba, although Bathsheba is not named in Matthew's genealogy, she's simply called the wife of Uriah. So you have 4 women there: the prostitute, the woman who dressed up like a prostitute to seduce her father-in-law, Bathsheba, and Ruth. That's quite a list there that you get. But, all right, let's move forward to a passage that I just love. The whole earth had one language and the same words. Okay, so we've stepped back, obviously, all of a sudden, because just the previous chapter, everybody had a bunch of different languages. So we're not telling this thing chronologically, clearly. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon, and this they seems to be everybody, right? The whole earth. They came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. And they said, Let us build ourselves a tower, and a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, several things that are happening here that I think we can miss if we're not careful. One, this word heavens is that same word that is happening in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1. It is a dual. In other words, heavens, there are 3 heavens in the mind of the ancient Israelite. There is the heavens where the birds fly, there is the heavens where the planets are and the stars, and then there's the heavens where God lives. All right? This heaven is the dual, the same as Genesis 1, and that is, it's the birds fly and the planets are. So in other words, these guys are wanting to build a tower to the edge of creation. All right? This is not just we're going to build it up into the sky. It is we are going to be knocking on the doorsteps of God's house with this. All right? This is a challenge to God, and it goes further because it's let us make a name for ourselves. This translation of it makes me a little. We talk about translations of Bench Retreat. This one makes me a little iffy. This is a little iffy with this translation because it is very formal correspondence. For those of you who are there, it is very literal in its translation, and the problem with that in this case is that's an idiom in our language. If we want to make a name for ourselves, we have that idiom, right? I'm going to go make a name for myself. I'm going to become famous. I'm going to be successful. That's not this. That sense is not in this idiom. In this particular idiom, make a name for ourselves. Names give insight into character, right? Names, you live into your name in ancient Israel. up to or down to your name, typically. To make a name for ourselves is to claim we are going to define our character, right? We are not going to allow that come from the outside. Ultimately, God, I think, is the implication in this text. So we are going to call the shots for who we are. So they're building a tower to the edge of heaven so that they can define themselves, so that they won't be scattered over the face of the whole earth, which you might recall is exactly what God told them to do at the very beginning of the story twice, right? He's told them in Genesis 1, fill the earth and subdue it, and he told them in Genesis 9, fill the earth and subdue it. And they said, if we don't do this, we're going to have to fill the earth. It's like, yeah, that was kind of what you were created to do. That was kind of what he told you to do. So all of these things, all three of these things, are expressed as a direct attack against the Almighty. This is a direct attack.
Defiance.
It is. It is three different expressions of an act of defiance in this context. All right, we're going to storm the gates of heaven. We're going to define our character. We're not relying on God to define our character because we don't want to do what God has called us to do. That is basically the argument there. You with me on that? Troubles, concerns, clarifications? Okay. Then comes to me one of the funniest parts of this story. There are a lot of funny parts in the Bible. This one cracks me up, right? They are going to build a tower to storm the gates of heaven. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people had built. They were so small, God couldn't even see them from where he was. Right? I just love that. It's like, we're going to storm the gates of heaven. What are they doing? I can't see them from here. It's even a statement of how high God is in the text here, that God has to come down to see what in the world is going on. And the Lord said, look, they are one people and have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they'll do. Nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down. I think this is going to be a royal we, much like we find in Genesis 1 again. Could be talking to the divine council, but I think for me it makes more sense that this is God's kingship, especially with the whole God came down idea. The point is God is transcendent and sovereign in this text. Let's go down and confuse their language there so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, over all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad from the face of the earth. Well, the very action they were trying to prevent, they brought about by their activity, which sounds very Greek in this story. Hubris always wins. The Greeks teach us that. But that's what ends up happening. The action they were trying to prevent is what they brought about by their acts of defiance here. Well, let me just see what you have to say before I say what I have to say. Yes?
Does Babel become Babylon then?
Yes. This is Israel throwing at Babylon's head here. You know what your name means? Nobody understands each other, as opposed to them thinking themselves royal and great and terrific.
So this is to be read in parallel with what we read before. They're just kind of flipped.
Right. Probably an exposition of one moment of that. Like, yeah, some read Genesis 2 that way with Genesis 1, right? That those are happening sometimes. Yes.
To the extent that Babel in vernacular English means to babble,
Yeah,
it works in English.
it does.
Is in other European languages, Indo-European.
We did it from this.
They have similar.
Well, yeah, they had it, and so we've taken it along in ours. That's where that comes from, etymologically. Yeah, that's my understanding of the etymology there. So I just thought of a joke. People who don't know the difference between etymology and entomology really bugs me. I don't normally do puns, but that one's always really tough for some. So anyway. What was that?
What's the joke?
Find a friend. They can help you with that. All right. Any other thoughts here? Because I want to. What's going on here is interesting to me, and I have been one who have used the same language. I have used the phrase "the curse of Babel," and I have used the phrase that the language, the changing of language, being a curse or a punishment, or that's something along those lines. That this is somehow negative. And I've had some interpreters recently, and I say recently, like in the past 7 or 8 years, as I've been looking at this text, make me sort of re-question that a little bit and wonder if I haven't been reading this the wrong way. Because what ends up happening, you'll notice, is that the changing of the language is the means by which God gets humanity back on track to do what God called them to do to begin with. So on some levels, it's not exactly a punishment. It's God trying to get people to do what God created and called those people to do to begin with. So that the misunderstanding of language, while frustrating and obviously stopping what they were doing, is what it takes to spread them out and get them to do what God needed them to do to begin with. And part of what has influenced my reading of that is actually Pentecost as well. But well, let me stop there for a second. You see where I was going with that notion of this changing of language being the thing that sort of spreads them out?
You group together in communities of language.
Right.
One thing.
Exactly. And so they're moving out as a result. So this changing of language is the cattle prod that gets the people moving again, because they settled. They're gonna, we're gonna land here in this plain, and we're happy here now. We're gonna stay here. And God's, moving them out. Yeah.
Doesn't that interpretation kind of go against the idea of what myths typically do? Myths typically have a problem. The problem is, and they reverse engineer to get to
Right.
solve the problem. So
Right.
there are many languages. Why are there so many confusing
Right.
languages? Well, here's a story that explains that or answers that question.
And I would agree 100% with that. Only I would say the Bible's coming along and saying, and it's not a bug, it's a feature. That this was not something that was done as punishment, but something that was done as a way to get us, humanity, fulfill the calling that God had in Genesis 1 and 9. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's an etiology. It's that reverse engineering of the question, without question. But I think there's a way to spin it positively. That this is not punishment so much as it is a cattle prod, tough love or something. I don't know what else to call it. What has really influenced my reading of that has been Mike's reading of Pentecost. Now, some of you know my podcast with Mike McKeever, my New Testament colleague. He's an Luke Acts expert. And he'd always said that Pentecost, I've always said Pentecost was a reversal of Babel. That Pentecost was, that the gospel was a unifying factor, that instead of God giving everybody one language to fix the whole Babel problem, he used the gospel to unify everyone, and that the gospel can be translated into culture. So it's actually the gospel that unifies us, and our diversity is actually a strength at that point. That's the way I had talked about it for years. But Mike said, no, when I talk about it, I say that Pentecost is a reversal of Babel. No, excuse me, I say reversal. He says it's a reproduction of Babel. That what happened was the Christians were centered in Jerusalem and living in Jerusalem, and I'll say happy in Jerusalem, but that's where they were trying to find their identity in Jerusalem. And the rest of the story of Acts is the story of God dragging them to diversity. And that the Spirit then speaks to all these places and then goes out from Jerusalem through the rest of the book of Acts. So that in the same way that the people are going out from the world here, Pentecost is sending them out as well as a reproduction of Babel. I think we're both saying the same thing, but we're saying it kind of differently. It's really how you cast what's going on here. But I think he's convinced me that that's what's happening. That the temple had become a little bit idolatrous in the mind of the people, and they're trying to send them out from that temple into the rest of the world. And I think that's probably the right reading, actually. Yeah.
How do you interpret it seems clear to me in 6 and 7 that the way God is portrayed there, that there's a real concern that if they get together and they talk about it, they're gonna cause trouble.
Yeah.
And if we don't get them confused, they're gonna get together and cause trouble.
Right. It reminds me of Genesis 6, right, where the heavens are under attack again, the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the flood becomes an act of self-defense in that kind of telling. I think it's almost that reading that same kind of self-defense way. We got to do something about this before it spins out of control and people keep causing problems. Yeah.
Is confused a good translation in your mind?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. Yep. And so they make the pun on Babylon that thought themselves so great and big and powerful at that point. Yep. Now, one of the things that I said, let me make sure I'm doing this right. Yeah, that's what I thought. One of the things that I said when we looked at Genesis 1 was that the Bible is occasional literature. Right? Nobody sits down and says, you know what, I've got this great idea for a creation narrative. I got this great idea to tell this story in this way. Nobody does that. There's always something that motivates it. And so in the context of Genesis 1, people are saying this about creation. The Bible says no, this about creation. In Genesis 6 to 9, people are saying this about the flood. The Bible says no, this about the flood. Well, believe it or not, there was conventional understanding about a tower. In the Enuma Elish, which you might recall from our first night together, the Babylonian creation story. In this Babylonian creation story, as soon as the creation is done, the people go to Marduk, and they address the Lord Marduk, and they said, now, Lord, seeing as you've established our freedom, what favor can we do for you? Let's make a shrine of great renown. Your chamber will be our resting place wherein we may repose. Let's erect a shrine to house a pedestal wherein we may repose when we finish the work. When Marduk heard this, he beamed as brightly as the light of the people. Love it when you do nice things for them. You know, we want to build a statue to you. Oh, that makes me so happy. He beamed brightly as the light of day. Build Babylon, the task you have sought. Let bricks for it be molded, and raise the shrine. And the Anunnaki are like lower god. They're the middle gods, right? You've got the big high gods like Marduk and the rest, and then you've got the Anunnaki, and then people come down below. The Apkallu are, I think, members of the Anunnaki, for those of you who remember the Apkallu. The Anunnaki wielded the pick for 1 year. They made the needed bricks. So they just spent a year just making bricks. That's how big this tower was. We just got to make the bricks. When the second year arrived, they raised the peak of Esagil, a replica of the Apsu. They built the lofty temple tower of the Apsu. And for Anu and Enlil and Ea, they established it as a dwelling. So there's this tower that is built in Babylon where they molded bricks and they built it, and it became a place of feasting and party. The Anunnaki even got their own shrines afterwards, so it was really something that was to be celebrated. Look how big we are, look how important we are, look how great things are. The Bible comes along and tells the story of, yeah, you know what? There were a lot of people, they got together not long after creation, in this case the flood, and they did make bricks and build a tower, but it wasn't in any way commendable. It wasn't a good thing. In fact, it was an act of arrogance. It was to think that they were better than the world. It was to show off. And I really think that much of Genesis 11, I think, is in the direct attack of this Enuma Elish story and the way in which the ziggurats were the Middle Eastern pyramids that had temples at the top of them. And the way in which the ziggurats were perceived, these big towers that had temples at the top, you could reach to the heavens. And I think the Bible's coming along and saying, yeah, no, this is not a commendable thing. This is not a good thing. In fact, this is a terrible thing. This is an act of arrogance. In fact, it's not Babylon, this great, glorious place. It's Babel. You people can't even understand each other. That's where it really comes from. So, I mean, it really is a polemic against the world around it, I think, there in Genesis 11. So, any questions there? It's always helpful to have the context, the cultural context. Steve, yeah, go ahead.
Does that complete upon with the declaration at the beginning? Let us make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
I'm saying like, yeah, you did. So.
Yeah. This is the name you're making for yourself. Yeah, not great. Yeah. Good stuff. Sit down, enjoy. Oh, they had beer mugs at the banquet. That's what I was gonna. It was a big party. It was a big party.
So this one lasted. They got this one done, huh?
Yeah, this one
They built this one.
they stayed this one. Yeah, it was celebrated. Yeah, absolutely. Only took them 2 years though. But I mean, the first whole year was bricks, just focusing on the bricks. And some have suggested that it's somehow it's kind of a mockery, just that they're going to build this tower because they're coming out of mountains. They're settling in a plain, so they're coming obviously out of mountains. So now they have to build their own mountain. So that some have read that as the bricks as a mockery, that rather than actually worshiping on mountains, which are obviously closer to heaven, mountains are always special, that's where all the gods always live, is on mountains, that they come down into the plain and have to build their own mountains, and then make a name for themselves. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's possible that just the act of building bricks might be seen that way, I don't know. That the fact they're emphasizing plain in the Bible with the bricks, I think could be significant. The fact that they have bricks here, I think, would undermine that reading, but there's no plain mentioned, so maybe not. Well, back to our primeval history. Remember when I started this little journey with you, I said Genesis 1 through 11 is called the primeval history. And this is a place where God is dealing with all of creation at the same time. And God's relationship to this creation seems to change as you go through it. As I say in Genesis 2 and 3, with Adam and Eve, God is walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, which I said now that when I moved to Illinois, I learned what that was. because they have the cool of the day in Illinois. In Texas and Georgia, we didn't have the cool of the day. You had hot, and then you had hot and also dark. Those are your two options. Cain and Abel, God does speak to Cain, and Cain speaks back to God, so there is dialogue there. In the flood narrative, God speaks to Noah. Noah never speaks to God. In fact, Noah never speaks in the story until the end, that really weird passage that we're just not going to talk about because it screws up a good story. And then the Tower of Babel, I love that God speaks to God. There's not even left to talk to, it seems. Let's go down and see what they're doing, because there doesn't even seem to be anybody to address in the Babel story. So as you get through the story, you can see, I think, God, well, how about this one? God feeling more remote. I would argue humanity getting more remote as the story goes on. And God finally decides he's going to do something different after this story. So thoughts on that? You know when I realized this? And this is, I think, an important tip, and for those of you who didn't come to the What is the Bible men's retreat, I realized this when I was in a graduate seminar in the Pentateuch, and our assignment was to go home this weekend, and from Friday to Sunday, read as much of the Pentateuch in one sitting as you could. So from Genesis to Deuteronomy, sit down and go, just as far as you can through that as one sitting. And if you have to take a break, take a break, but get through the whole thing by Sunday and read it together. And it was really it was at that moment I realized how episodically I had read the Bible. Where you just leap into Cain and Abel, or Adam and Eve, or the flood, or the Tower of Babel, or David, or whatever, and to take a moment to just go through and get a moment for the transitions and the story and the narrative. And that was at that moment, I was like, wow, look at what is happening with God in that, because I don't think I'd ever just sat and read Genesis 1 through 11 at one sitting. And it really did get that sense of the divine seeming further and further away as humanity was moving on. So whenever you get a chance, read broadly. You can focus on the little things too, but it's nice to see how those little things fit in that 30,000-foot view. It's important to remember that, I think. When they returned from exile, it says Ezra read the whole law while Israel was standing there. That wouldn't be a lot of fun, I don't think. So I just spat, imagining sitting on Sunday morning saying, well, I'll be reading in the spirit of Ezra the entire Torah this morning, and then I have to look for a new job. But I don't want to do that. Anyway. Any thoughts on that before we go any further? Yeah.
I would suggest that the authors, in committing this to writing and looking back on the situations they were describing in their stories, are imagining, were we, being the human race, drifting farther and farther away from God, and it's reflected the way you said, to the point where God's not even talking to anybody.
Yeah, can't even, just gotta talk to God's self,
Because the human race has drifted away in the sense that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're not following their
Right.
acts of defiance, all those things.
And I do love, we laughed, and you guys laughed about it too, but I love that notion that we're going to build a tower that storms the gates of heaven, and God says, let's go down and see what they're doing. Can't even see it from where I am. Our tower's so big, and God can't even see it. That's how transcendent God is to the human race at this point, by the time you get to the end of the story. Well, we're about to set up something new. Genesis 1 through 11 is really a unique bit, and I shared the first night we did this. Any Old Testament professor who's gotten in trouble at a college teaching, it's usually been Genesis 1 to 11. And I shared that my mentor at this very conservative small Baptist college in Mississippi, when I was sitting in Old Testament with him, we got into the survey class, and he said, okay, Genesis 1 through 11 is known as the primeval history. Now, Genesis 12. That was it. That was the whole thing. That was all of my Genesis 1 through 11 conversation. Wasn't going to talk about that no more. So, it's one that's kind of a touchy subject for a lot of people, but I've always, I've wandered in where angels fear to tread plenty of times. And I just feel like, let's look at this and have a moment to see. I think Genesis 1 through 11, and I've said it many times, and I'll say it again, is very much the Old Testament version of the Bible saying, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. So all the way through that passage, it is, you have heard this, it is again, the biblical text is about God, right? These stories of creation, the flood, the tower, those are a means to an end. Those aren't trying to give us the intricate details on creation, flood, and tower. Those are trying to use those stories to talk about the divine. In the same way that, and I would say an analogous way to when I preach, if I pull an element out of my own life, Now, I promise you, I don't make anything up, but I will select parts of that story that are going to, again, feed into the narrative I'm preaching at that point. I'm not giving you the whole story of that situation. I'm giving you the elements of that story that feed into that. So it's not to give you a detailed history of how my life goes in those moments. It is to use that moment to help understand this larger truth about the divine. That's what's happening, I think, in an analogous way here in the primeval history. That they're using creation, they're using the flood, they're using the building of cities, and the creative possibility of humanity and the genealogy of Cain, the tower story. These are all narratives everyone knew. They all knew about creation. They all knew about the tower. They all knew about the flood. And the Bible is saying, when you think of them this way because they point to this kind of God. So it's really being used as a corrective, these 1 through 11 stories. And really, 1 through 11 is unique. You don't get other material like this in the Old Testament. I mean, these are different kinds of stories that you get. And sometimes they can cause some challenge in interpretation. I've seen very good interpreters, do badly on Genesis 1 through 11. And once you get on 12 through 50 and you get on the stories of the ancestors and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, their interpretations are much better. But there's a failure to really know how to handle this sort of epic, poetic kind of, I say poetic, this epic narratives that you have here. I think I mentioned a few weeks ago. Everyone else in the ancient Near East, when they told these stories, the flood, the tower, creation, they always used poetry. The Bible uses prose. I don't know why that is. They follow the conventions of the rest of the world, but on that, they tell them in prose. And I don't know what that means, but I think it means something, as Dr. Ballinger used to say. That's significant somehow. I don't know what that is.
Were there other major stories in the ancient times that the Bible didn't address?
Oh, yeah. I think so. And I also think there are other ancient stories the Bible doesn't address but might allude to. I think the Jacob and Esau story resonates, when we get there, I'll point it out, resonates really strongly in parts with Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And I think the Bible is deliberately invoking Gilgamesh and Enkidu when it's talking about Jacob and Esau in those stories. So there's no, Gilgamesh, there's no Tale of Achat, there are plenty of other ancient stories, but the Bible is addressing the ones it feels like it can talk about God with. I mentioned the Tale of Achat. Tale of Achat is a Canaanite story. It's Ugaritic. And it's about this righteous man named Danel. There's no I in it, so it's just D-A-N-E-L. And he goes in search of his son who's been lost and travels, I believe, to the underworld to find him. The reason that's significant is because in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel says even if Job or Noah or Daniel were around, God would still destroy Judah. And most interpreters don't think that Daniel is the Daniel of the exile, but that Daniel refers to that early Canaanite story of Daniel, and talking about these righteous antediluvian heroes like Job, or Job is antediluvian, but these ancient pre-Israelite heroes, faith, they might be mentioning. So there's plenty of references that we don't get, right? There's plenty of allusions there. Everybody's a product of their culture, and everybody's dripping in this culture, and so I can make a reference to, what can I make a reference to? The Super Bowl, and everybody knows I can make that in passing without explaining what it is. The Bible can do that with other things that we don't get. Mm-hmm.
How does this history fit in with Egyptian history? This is all written down
It is.
long after the Egyptian
Mhm.
day, right?
And Akkadian and
The Egyptians wouldn't have access to these
Mm-mm.
myths, right?
And their myths are a little different. Their stories of creation, it's clear that the Sinai splits the way you think about the world. And part of that is just the nature of, in Genesis, water is chaotic and scary and dangerous. That's because the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, they flood unpredictably, right? They destroy, they damage, they lead to famine and flood. The Nile's predictable, right? Water is, it's easy. It's eternal. It's garden-like. In fact, the Garden of Eden is compared to Egypt in several places in the Old Testament because it's always regular and always fertile, and you can always count on it, and you don't have these. So the Sinai seems to divide these myths. So Egypt had their own kind of concepts of creation and the way the world works. Yeah, Absolutely. The Bible moves us at the end of the story. Now, this is after the tower incident. We get full-on genealogy. And it's worth mentioning Terah here, the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his... Haran's interesting because Haran it's like a guy named Austin from Austin. Because Haran was from Haran, interestingly enough, or not far from Haran anyway. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham and Nahor took wives, and Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarah was barren and had no child. This is a theme. We're going to talk a little bit about type scenes when we get into the stories of the patriarchs. And I'm sorry, I try to say ancestors because I like to include the women too. Barrenness is a regular occurring problem that we have with all three of our matriarchs. She had no child. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot to the land of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205, and Terah died in Haran. And that's the end of Genesis 11. So that sets up what God is about to do, something brand new in Genesis 12. We're tired of dealing with everybody all at once, and we're about to leap off into something brand new as a way to try and reconcile creation back to God, because dealing with everybody is just not working. So it's just not getting any better. So. Good stuff there, genealogy. I like to give genealogies a little bit of attention. Not a lot, it'd be a boring night, but any nuggets I can find. What's your thoughts?
There it is.
What's that? You have no thoughts? I'm just such a thorough teacher is what it is.
Some of those-
What question? There it is. I knew that wasn't it. I knew that wasn't it.
Some of those folks that we read about lived a long time.
They
But
did.
Didn't we see at the end of the creation story that
And
we were gonna kind of cap it off at?
cap it at 3 generations. Yep, 120 years. That's it, no more than that. That's what God said.
So they just had a different calendar, they weren't good at counting, it.
I can tell you this. Let me open by saying 2 things about this. First, I don't know. Second, nobody else does either. The people who tell you they do make me awfully nervous, and I don't listen to them. But I can tell you this. There is a shared cultural understanding in the ancient Near East that before the flood, everybody lived a long time. After the flood, the lifespans come down to normal. That I know. In fact, in the Sumerian king lists, these lists of kings that reign in Sumer, 13,000 years, 7,000 years, 12,000 years, and then the flood came over the land, and the king's reigns come down, and the last king I think is 17 years. So I don't know what was going on in the mind of the ancient world before the flood. Huge lifespans. In fact, compared to the ancient Near East, the rest of the ancient East, the Bible looks reasonable. 969 doesn't seem so bad at that point. But then the flood comes, and then
This is
normalizes.
part of that whole, the whole school about the flooding of the Black Sea that spawned this idea, was that was such a traumatic event, happened so fast.
Right.
Within 1 month,
Right.
you had thousands of cultures, or
Right.
of communities displaced.
It's gone.
That for several thousand
Yeah.
years was retained in an oral tradition.
Maybe.
Something bad happened.
Terrible. That changed fundamentally everything. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. But it's a fascinating. In my mind, it's a fascinating shared cultural understanding that prior to the flood. Oh, real trivia question for you. Who lived the longest? Everyone knows this one, right? Methuselah, right? Methuselah lived the longest. Anyone know how long?
969.
969 years. Died before his dad. Yeah. How is that possible? It's true. But how is it possible that the man who lived the longest died before his father? Anyone know?
He had a stepdad.
Not stepdad, no. His father was Enoch, who walked with God and was no more. Was never said to die. Lived for 365 years. Walked with God and was no more. Yeah, that's a great. Nobody ever gets that one, so. I get pastors with that one, that's not that was not
Okay.
I also get pastors with the book of Hezekiah, so don't be too impressed by
Okay.
some of your pastors. Yeah, my favorite story of Enoch was it's sort of an old Jewish tradition that God and Enoch used to walk together because he walked with God. And that one time at the end of the day, God said to Enoch, you know, we're a lot closer to my house than yours, why don't you just come on with me? And that's the story. So, that's what happened. You're wondering. Okay, sure, why not? But by the way, because anytime you get that kind of a story, anytime you get the assumption like Enoch, Elijah, anytime you get that, the Bible has all kinds of fun with it. I mean, why say the Bible? Tradition has all kinds of fun with it, you know. So that's where the tradition of Elijah preceding the coming of the Messiah comes from. Elijah doesn't die, so he's got to return and announce the coming, which Christians see fulfilled in John the Baptist. Yeah.
So earlier that made me think, in the Iliad, there's this common refrain that Homer gives. It's like, strong as men were in those days before. And there's a similar passage, I think, earlier. In
Genesis 6, the heroes of old.
Exactly,
men of
heroes of
renown.
old men of renown.
Yeah.
Was there some ancient tradition of not just longevity, but just greatness in general,
I think
like
so.
human accomplishment that they felt had been lost? They're
Yeah.
trying to
I
wash it
think so.
over.
And I mean, I think you get that in Tolkien, right, with the Men of Numenor. Right? It's
Yeah.
the same kind of, I think those traditions are kind of shared there. Yeah. I'm in my annual reread of The Lord of the Rings. So. All it does is make me angry at the movies. But I enjoy it. They get worse, as far as I'm concerned. 1 through 6, that's the way I rank them, 1 through 6. So.
Does the concept of power appear anywhere else in the scriptures?
No, you don't get much anywhere else. No, in fact, you don't get much about any of this mentioned anywhere. I mean, well, creation, right? Cain and Abel don't show up. You don't get much of this anywhere else. It's unusual. And you don't have a whole lot of it around the ancient Near East. I think the Enuma Elish having that is significant. But good thoughts. All right, well, we're going to start something whole new next week. We're going into Abram and Sarai and type scenes, and I actually love doing the Abraham and Sarah stuff. I think you'll enjoy it as well. So I will let you go. So blessings upon you all as you go your way. I will see you next week, right? No, next week we have trunk or treat. And then next week after that is Tazay. So I'll see you in 3 weeks. So next week I'll be dressed as the 4th Doctor in Doctor Who, out by my car giving out candy. So. Have you decided who you're going to be, Ray? You were trying to decide between Noah and Dracula last time. So the best part is we're going to be doing staff evaluations next Wednesday, and I can't wait to do a staff evaluation of Ray as Dracula or Noah. That would be a tremendous moment there. So, all right. Have a great night.